Nobody wanted the 300-pound bride until Mountain Man carried her home. The church bells of Cedar Ridge tolled with cruel indifference as Martha Whitfield stood alone at the altar for the third time. 28 years old, heavy-set at 300 pounds, she had long since grown used to whispers in the pews. But when Thomas Brennan, her would-be husband, cleared his throat and stepped back, his words cut sharper than any blade. "I cannot," he declared loudly enough for the congregation to hear, "I will not marry a woman who refuses to see reason about her condition." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The minister froze mid-prayer. Martha's cheeks burned as Thomas's family gathered their things and walked out, leaving her standing in a gown stitched with hope, now mocked as folly. Someone snickered. Others whispered. One woman muttered, "Poor girl, third time. Who would want her now?" Martha didn't cry. Not there, not before them. She lowered her veil, gathered her skirts, and walked down that aisle alone, her heart pounding with humiliation. In the weeks that followed, the sting lingered. She worked at the general store, her smile polite as she wrapped ribbons and weighed flour for brides-to-be who spoke gaily of honeymoons. Every laugh, every sparkle of a ring was a reminder of what had been denied her. She had become the town's tragic figure, pitied, gossiped about, dismissed. But the breaking point came at the Harvest Festival. Lanterns glowed, fiddles played, and Thomas Brennan swaggered up, his tone mockingly gracious. "Perhaps we might revisit the matter," he said, "if you'll accept certain conditions." When Martha refused, his mask slipped. He sneered, voice loud enough for the crowd. "Ungrateful and ridiculous, given your obvious shortcomings." Laughter flared. Martha fled into the night, her tears hidden by the storm clouds gathering above the mountains, never knowing she was running straight into the arms of a man who would change her life. The storm broke with sudden fury. Wind tore through the valley, rain stung like whips, and the mountain path turned to slick clay under Martha's boots. Her heart hammered with shame and fury, but as she stumbled into the darkness, she realized she had strayed too far from the lantern lights of Cedar Ridge. Her ankle twisted on a rock. Pain shot up her leg, dropping her into the mud. She tried to rise, but the storm pressed down, relentless. Each gust of wind whispered the same cruel refrain, unwanted, unworthy, unloved. By the time the beam of a lantern cut through the sheets of rain, Martha was half-conscious, shivering. The light belonged to Ezra Stone. The people of Cedar Ridge spoke of him in hushed tones. A giant of a man, broad as a doorway, with a scar down his jaw and a silence that unnerved even the boldest ranchers. They called him dangerous, cursed, a hermit who had lost his family and lost his mind. Children dared each other to creep to the edge of his land and swear they'd heard wolves howling at his command. But the man who bent to lift Martha from the mud carried no trace of menace. His arms were strong, steady, and careful as he gathered her into his chest. "Easy now," his deep voice rumbled above the storm. "You're safe." She wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't a burden, but the pain in her ankle silenced her. His coat smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, his chest warm against her soaked dress. When she opened her eyes again, she was in a cabin unlike any she'd seen. The walls were stacked logs, sealed with clay, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, a stone hearth glowing with fire. The storm's roar was muted here, replaced by the crackle of flames. Ezra knelt by her, wrapping her ankle with clean linen, His hands were rough, but his touch was gentle. He didn't leer, didn't smirk at her sighs, didn't ask the cruel questions that haunted her in town. He only said, "You'll heal. You'll rest here till you can stand." Martha swallowed hard, unused to kindness without condition. "Why? Why help me?" she whispered. Ezra paused, his eyes shadowed beneath his brow. "Because no one else would." The word struck her like an arrow, simple, unadorned, but carrying a weight she couldn't name. For days she rested in that cabin. Ezra spoke little, yet his silence was never sharp. He split wood, cooked broth, and left it by her side without comment. She, in turn, tidied the cabin, folded his laundry, and mended his worn shirts. They orbited each other awkwardly at first, but slowly the cabin filled with something warmer than the fire: respect. And one evening, as rain pattered softly on the roof, Ezra finally told her the truth of why he lived alone, that once he had a wife and a son, both taken by fever, and he had buried his heart with them 5 winters ago. Martha listened, her hands folded in her lap, her own wounds of humiliation and rejection echoing his. 2 souls, bruised but unbroken, finding in each other not pity, but recognition. The town had cast her aside, the mountain had swallowed him whole. But in that cabin, something fragile and new began to take root. The storm did not end when Martha's strength returned. It deepened, swallowing the valley in white, turning paths to rivers of ice. Ezra knew the mountain well enough to prepare. He stacked wood, set snares for game, and salted meat. But the cabin, however sturdy, could not shield them forever. One morning, when the sky lightened but the wind still howled, Ezra pulled on his coat. "We'll need more supplies," he said. "The pass might close for weeks. You'll come with me." Martha blinked in surprise. "With you? On those trails?" "You're no fragile china doll," he answered, his gaze firm. "And you'll see the truth of this mountain better than hiding from it." She hesitated but agreed. Soon she found herself wrapped in a cloak of heavy wool, boots laced tight. Ezra guided her outside. The air was biting, the snow deep, but his stride was steady, and he carved a path she could follow. When she stumbled, his hand closed around hers, steadying, lifting, not judging. The trail wound through pines bowed with snow, across a frozen creek that groaned beneath their boots. Martha's breath fogged before her, her cheeks stung with frost, but every time she thought she could go no further, Ezra paused, offering a strip of jerky or a sip from his flask. His voice was rough, but his words carried weight. "You're stronger than you think. Keep walking." At midday, they reached a ridge where the wind tore the clouds apart, revealing the valley below. From there, Martha saw Cedar Ridge, the faint smoke of chimneys, the town that had mocked her, distant and small. For the first time, she felt the scale of the world, how much bigger it was than the gossip of church pews. She turned to Ezra, his face weathered by wind and grief, and said softly, "I thought I'd never be more than what they called me." Ezra's eyes held hers. "You're not what they call you. You're what you endure, what you choose." The words rooted in her heart. By the time they trudged back to the cabin, arms laden with flour and salt, night had fallen. Ezra lit the fire, and Martha, still flushed from the trek, prepared a stew. The scent of onions and venison filled the room, and for the first time since her humiliation she laughed, a small surprised sound when Ezra dropped a spoon and cursed under his breath. He glanced at her, startled. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. It was not a smile of mockery. but one of rare warmth. They ate by the hearth, the flames dancing between them. Outside the storm raged, but within those walls something fragile and defiant stirred. Later, as Ezra unrolled his bed by the fire and left the cabin's only bed for her, Martha felt a lump rise in her throat. So many men had measured her worth by her body, sneered at her weight, reduced her to shame. Yet here was a man who carried her without complaint, who gave her his strength without demand, who spoke to her as if she were equal. Lying beneath the quilt, listening to the steady crackle of firewood and the deep rhythm of his breathing, Martha felt her heart beat differently, not with humiliation, not with dread, but with something she had thought forever denied her: hope. Days blurred into weeks as the snow sealed them in. What might have felt like imprisonment instead became a season of discovery. For Martha, each morning began with the sound of Ezra splitting logs outside, the steady rhythm of his axe echoing through the valley. When he returned, snow clinging to his beard, she would have coffee waiting. Their exchanges were simple, but every word chipped away at the silence that once divided them. She busied herself with the cabin. Dust was swept from corners, linens washed and mended, shelves rearranged to make the place feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Ezra didn't interfere. He only observed, quietly pleased as her presence softened the edges of his solitude. One morning, Martha caught him watching as she kneaded bread at the table. Flour streaked her cheek, her hands working steadily. Embarrassed, she laughed. "I must look a sight." Ezra shook his head. "You look right." The word hung in the air, awkward but honest. Martha turned back to her dough, her heart fluttering in a way it hadn't for years. Their days filled with shared tasks. Ezra showed her how to mend a snare, how to split kindling safely, how to carry water without spilling it on icy paths. In turn, she taught him small domestic graces, how to darn a sock, how to season stew so it sang with flavor. Neither boasted, each offered what they knew, and each accepted without pride. Evenings were the heart of their bond. The fire glowed, casting their shadows long across the log walls. Martha would read aloud from the single book she had carried from town, her voice clear and warm. Ezra would sit near, whittling small figures out of pine, his eyes softening as her words filled the room. Sometimes, when she paused to sip tea, she caught him studying her, not with the scorn she knew so well, but with a quiet curiosity, almost reverence. It made her cheeks burn, though she dared not look away. One night, after a day of heavy snow, Ezra laid an axe across the table. "You should learn," he said simply. Martha stared. "Me? Chop wood? Why not? Winter doesn't spare anyone." So he led her outside, showed her how to grip the handle, how to let the weight of the axe do the work. Her first swings clattered clumsily, but Ezra's hands closed gently over hers, guiding her motion. His breath warmed her cheek as he murmured, "There, strong, try again." The log split clean. Martha gasped, then laughed with delight. Ezra stepped back, a rare smile flickering across his face. "Told you." In that moment, she felt powerful, not mocked, not diminished, but capable. Their gestures grew tender in ways neither dared name. He always poured her bowl first at supper. She sewed an extra quilt for his pallet by the fire, though he rarely used it, preferring to let her take the bed in comfort. Once, when her ankle ached from the old sprain, he wordlessly lifted her foot into his lap and wrapped it with fresh linen. The touch made her chest ache with something deeper than gratitude. Yet both carried wounds. Ezra, haunted by the graves of his wife and son. Martha, scarred by the whispers of a town that had never let her forget her weight. At night, when the wind howled, those ghosts seemed to sit with them in silence. But slowly, gently, the silence shifted. One evening, as Martha stirred soup, Ezra spoke without looking up. The storm took more than my family. It took the man I was. I thought I'd never find him again. He paused, then met her eyes. But with you here, it feels less empty. Martha's hand trembled on the spoon. She wanted to answer, but words caught in her throat. Instead, she set the ladle down, reached across the table, and covered his rough hand with her own. He didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, Martha felt that perhaps she wasn't too much, too heavy, too unwanted, but exactly enough. And as the snow fell outside, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge for one lonely soul, but the beginning of a life shared. The thaw came slow. Icicles dripped from the eaves, rivers cracked open, and trails turned to deep mud. With the melt came visitors from town, unwelcome ones. On a bright morning, a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Ezra stiffened, axe in hand, before swinging it open. On the step stood Reverend Alcott, his hat in hand, and beside him Martha's younger sister, Lillian. "Martha," Lillian said, her voice tight with embarrassment, "the whole town's talking. You can't stay here." Inside, Martha's face paled. "I had no choice. I was injured. Ezra saved me." The Reverend cleared his throat. "Even so, child, tongues wag. Your reputation is fraying thin. The people of Cedar Ridge will not overlook a lady living in a bachelor's cabin. You must make it right. Either wed or leave town entirely." The words struck like a sentence passed. Martha's heart twisted. She had only just begun to feel safe, to feel seen. Now society demanded her return to the humiliation she had fled. Ezra bristled, stepping closer. "She owes them nothing, not a damn thing." But Martha lifted her hand, silencing him. "If I wed, it must be my choice, not theirs." The Reverend's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "You have little time, my dear. Make a decision before gossip turns crueler still." With that, they departed, leaving silence heavier than the storm had ever been. That very evening, another visitor arrived, this time on horseback, coat trimmed in city wool. He introduced himself as Mr. Carroway, a lawyer from Denver. His words carried more shock than the Reverend's. "Miss Whitfield," he said, bowing slightly, "I represent your late Aunt Eleanor's estate. She has left you a substantial inheritance, a working ranch of nearly 500 acres. Martha gasped. "A ranch? For me?" "Yes," Carroway replied, though his eyes flickered with apology. "But there is a stipulation. You must marry within 1 year, and the man must be approved by the estate board. Fail to do so, and the ranch reverts to charity." The paper he unfolded trembled in Martha's hands. It felt both like deliverance and another cruel trap. A future of independence dangled before her, but chained to conditions that threatened her heart. Ezra stood silent, arms crossed, his jaw set hard. Later, when Carroway left, Martha slumped into a chair, her head in her hands. "It's always the same," she whispered, "marriage used as a leash. My worth weighed against my body, my reputation, now even land." Ezra knelt beside her, his hand hovering before settling gently on her shoulder. "It doesn't have to be." She met his eyes, searching the storm-gray depths. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'll marry you," he said simply. "Not for gossip, not for appearances, for the ranch, for your right to live free. A bargain, plain and honest. Martha's breath caught. But we barely know each other. His gaze held steady. We know enough. You're strong. You're brave. You deserve better than what they've given you. Together, we could make that ranch thrive. No one else needs to decide your fate. The cabin was quiet, save for the fire's crackle. Martha's heart raced. A marriage of necessity. A union without promises of love. Yet the thought of walking back into Cedar Ridge alone, of surrendering her inheritance, filled her with dread. She swallowed, voice trembling, but resolute. If we do this, it's a partnership, built on respect. Ezra's lips curved in something almost like a smile. Respect, I can promise. By morning, the decision was made. Reverend Alcott was summoned again. With only the mountains as witness, vows were spoken, rings fashioned from silver bands Ezra had kept in a drawer. It was not the grand wedding Martha had once dreamed of, but it was hers. And when Ezra placed his hand over hers, calloused and warm, she felt something stir that no inheritance could measure. The ranch Eleanor had left behind was more than Martha had imagined. Rolling hills, cold streams, acres of grassland kissed by sun. But its promise drew trouble like vultures to carrion. Within a week, a rider thundered up their lane. Garrett Doyle, the cattle baron who ruled the county with fists and fire, dismounted with a smirk. Behind him stood the sheriff, hat low, hand resting near his holster. So, Garrett drawled, eyeing Martha as though she were a trespasser on her own land, the fat bride found herself a mountain man. Convenient. But this ranch, it won't last under you. Best sign it over, share the water rights with me, and I'll let you keep a corner to play house. Martha stood tall, though her heart pounded. This land was my aunt's, and now it is mine. I'll not sell a drop to you. Garrett's smile curdled. Careful, girl. I don't ask twice. The sheriff stepped forward, producing a folded paper. Ezra Stone, by order of the county, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and unlawful possession of property. Martha gasped. That's nonsense. He's done nothing but protect me. But Garrett only laughed. He's a ghost, sweetheart. No past, no standing. The law is mine here. Ezra's jaw tightened. Slowly he straightened, his presence filling the yard like a storm building in the sky. You want my past? His voice cut sharp. I was a captain in the Union Army, then a marshal for the federal courts. I put men like you in irons before, and I'll do it again. Garrett's face paled as riders appeared at the ridge, armed men in dusted coats bearing the star of federal deputies. Ezra raised his hand in silent signal. They fanned out, rifles gleaming. You overplayed your hand, Doyle, Ezra said. This ranch is hers, and the law you twisted will hang you now. The sheriff stammered, but deputies closed on him, wrenching the badge from his chest. Garrett's threats turned to curses as irons clamped his wrists. The townsfolk who had trailed behind watched in stunned silence as the cattle baron was hauled away, his empire of fear crumbling. When the dust cleared, Ezra turned to Martha. His rough hand brushed hers, steadying her shaking fingers. I swore this was just a bargain, he murmured, low so only she could hear. But that was a lie. I stayed because I wanted to. Tears blurred her vision, not of weakness, but of release. For the first time, she believed his strength was not a cage, but a shelter, and that she had been chosen, not pitied. Winter crept softly across Cedar Ridge, laying a quilt of white over the ranch that now belonged fully to Martha. The house she and Ezra raised together stood sturdy, its windows glowing against the dusk. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of stew and firewood into the night air. Inside, Martha sat at the heavy oak table, her hands folded in her lap. For so long she had been told she was too much, not enough, a burden. Now, in the warmth of the cabin, she felt only belonging. Ezra moved quietly about the room, setting another log on the fire, his large frame softened by the gentle flicker of the flames. He sat beside her, his presence as steady as the mountains themselves. For a moment neither spoke, letting the silence carry what words could not. Then he reached for her hand. "You're safe here," he said simply, his voice low, roughened with emotion. Her eyes brimmed with tears. "It feels like home, Ezra. For the first time, it truly does." He gave a small, almost shy smile. "It is your home now, if you'll have it." Martha let out a trembling laugh, the kind that comes only when hope replaces despair. She squeezed his hand, her heart lighter than it had ever been. Outside, the snow fell softly over the land that had once been contested, now theirs to protect and nurture. Inside, the fire burned brighter, casting shadows that danced along the cabin walls, shadows of a future yet unwritten. And as the night deepened, one question lingered, unspoken but alive in both their hearts. Was this love strong enough to weather every storm still waiting beyond the horizon? Every time I share a story like Martha's, I am reminded of how love and dignity can grow in the most unexpected places. Perhaps you, too, know what it feels like to be overlooked or to stand alone in the storm. But stories like this remind us that there is always hope, that kindness and courage can change everything. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know. And if you still believe in love, don't go anywhere. The next story waiting for you may touch your heart even deeper.